primer, sand, prime. 3. Getting closer.
Hey everyone, Chris here. Welcome back to our series on the Freewing Panther. You know, we've gone through and done a whole bunch of kit bashing on this model to add a bunch of really cool scale features. And so in this video, we are actually going through and finishing the model completely. And so what that means is preparation for paint. We gotta seal it all up, then we gotta primer it, and then go through the paint process, panel lines, weathering, all of that good stuff to give us a really nice looking scale representation of the F9F Panther. There's a lot to cover here, and we've got a whole lot of work to do. So let's go. Now, before we get into it, I want to mention this video is brought to you by PCBWay. If you have any kind of maker needs, like if you've got 3D printing or machining, electronics, anything of that sort that needs to be made, they have a huge list of services that they offer that are all related to that. And so if you are doing any kind of design work, they can help you realize those designs. And so be sure to check them out. I've got a link down in the description where you can check out their website, pcbway.com. And a big thank you to them for their support. One coat. Two. What was that sound? All right, so we've got 3 coats of the Minimax polyacrylic. Sometimes I'll do more. I'm kind of done. I just want to get on to the next step. So we're gonna let this dry fully, and then it's gonna be on to primer. Especially since we're not stripping paint or anything like that, 3 coats should be plenty. We've got the base paint underneath. It's gonna be primer next. All right, let's primer this beast up. Getting closer. All right, well, did I think 4 primer and sand coats. I'm tired of sanding at this point. So we are going to do a little glazing putty, and I've got a flashlight here, cast some shadows, see where the imperfections are, fill it with glazing putty, and then we'll sand that, do a final primer coat, and I think we'll call it good at that point. That first primer coat on there was, it always looks terrible, but as you primer and then sand it down, primer, sand it down, all of those micro voids start to fill, and so that's where that foam texture starts to disappear. But don't be discouraged if that first coat looks terrible, because it always does. It looked terrible here too. Now we got to fill in the bigger voids with the glazing putty, and then I think we'll be ready for paint.
And now we wait. All right, 4 coats I think it was ultimately, primer, sand, prime, maybe some additional areas to touch up, but wet sanded, 600 grit wet sand. I think it's time for paint. I think we're ready. Let's do it. I think it's time for some blue. Taping straight lines on complex curves is a pain, but I think we got it.
All right guys, so here is the finished Panther. We've gone through and smoothed it all out. We painted it, panel lined, weathered it. It is done. So first things first, I went and sealed up the entire airframe with Minwax polyacrylic. And what that does is it seals the whole airframe completely. All of that filler that we added in the previous video, well, that has porosity to it. And the Minwax is gonna seal all of that up. It's just a water-based polyurethane. And in this case, I ended up doing 3 coats. Typically I do 4 to 6, but I was feeling a little just kind of rushing through it, and that was a little bit of a mistake because throughout the process of getting this painted, I've been battling some foam texture. If I were to do it again, I would have done at least 4 coats. I debated doing a 4th coat, but I just wanted to get to the next step. So the other part of what the Minwax does is it helps stabilize the surface. It creates kind of a protective barrier and shell, stiffens up the airframe and such. I don't think the 3 coats was quite enough. If I were to do it again, I do 4, probably 5 coats actually. And so from there, as I was looking through things on the model, I noticed that there was something that looked a bit off about the leading edge of the vertical tail. I ended up straightening that out to make it a little bit more scale. I just added some filler there. It took more filler than I expected it to. What I would have done differently is to put balsa wood there and then add the filler in. It worked out fine, but it should be a straight leading edge on the dorsal tail. And so I wanted to fix that, give it a little bit better look. I had to go through, sand all that filler to shape, seal that up with the Minwax polyacrylic, and it worked out beautifully. So once I had done that, sealed it all up, then it was on to primer. And so the primer sand process is what really ends up smoothing out these foam airframes if you're doing a refinish like this. The polyacrylic seals it, stiffens it up, hardens it up, but the primer is what really ends up getting rid of that foam texture. What it takes is, you know, you lay down the first coat of primer and that first coat looks awful. You're like, oh my gosh, what is this texture, you know? But what you do is spray that down, let it dry, sand it down with 180 grit sandpaper, primer it again, sand it down again until you've done that 4 to 6 times. Every time you sand, the low spots are slowly getting built up with the primer. The high spots are getting sanded down, right? What ends up happening is it levels the surface out. And I'm using the Duplicolor filler primer. I've been really happy with that. But like I said, I was battling some foam texture that was popping through. And I think that was in part because I just didn't put enough poly there. And so I only did 4 primer, sand, primer coats. I probably could have stood to do 1 or 2 more, and that would have ended up getting rid of most of that foam texture that I was seeing popping through. But I was also banking on the fact that this was gonna be a matte finish, and matte finishes can hide a lot of mistakes, you'll find out. But once I had gotten it to the point where I was happy enough with it to take it to paint, I can't stress enough, if you are trying to do this and you are battling texture, take your time, be patient with it. You can get these insanely smooth if you go through the process. It's all a matter of how much time you want to put into it. You can get it as smooth as you physically possibly can if you want to spend more time primering, sanding, and all of that, right? Battling that foam texture, I knew because we were gonna have a matte finish that would probably help hide some of that. I just wanted to get on to the next step, and so I only did like 4 or so coats. Sanding in between coats, of course. And then I did a couple spot areas to try and build up a little bit more. And then I also did glazing putty on some of the larger imperfections, and that really helped a lot. If you've got large imperfections that are coming through, you can use a glazing putty over that primer, and that really helps a lot. You just have to be careful not to build up too much heat as you're sanding it. Otherwise, once that was all done, we got the surface smooth to where I wanted it, and it was on to paint. It first required wet sanding the entire airframe with 600 grit wet dry sandpaper. It smooths it all out, gets rid of any of the roughness you might have, gives the paint a better surface to adhere from. For the paint, I was very particular about the color. This is dark sea blue, which is FS35042. It is a very specific color. It's it's a dark blue, but it's got a hint of green in it. Not just any regular blue was gonna do for me, and so I ended up finding a new paint to me that I wasn't aware of. It's called SMS Premium Paint. They are airbrush ready, and they are spot on FS federal standard colors. And what was interesting about them is the coverage of the paint from the airbrush was absolutely fantastic. I've used the Mr. Paint brand before, which is fantastic paint, but what I found is the coverage from this SMS premium paint was better, just because it was more pigmented. It didn't require nearly as many coats. Like the white didn't take nearly as much paint as I was expecting it to get the coverage that I needed over the primer. Painted all of the white areas first in Insignia white, which is Federal Standard 37875, and then masked off for the blue. I used frog tape to mask all of that, cut thin strips with an X-Acto knife, and then use those to mask all of this because it's going to protect the surface underneath. Certain tapes run the risk of lifting up the surface even though you've done all of that prep work. So you want to set yourself up for success on this stuff. The frog tape detacked on a shirt or like on my cutting mat as I'm cutting it, man, it works beautifully. You get super clean, crisp lines. You've got to burnish it down a little bit. Really works out great, especially if you're airbrushing. And so painted the white, then went through, painted the blue. And that's when I really noticed some of that foam texture I was battling came through. It had to do with the sheen of the paint because it was not a true matte, it was kind of a satin or semi-gloss almost. As I was painting it, I was like, oh man, I was getting a little discouraged. But I was like, you know what? It's gonna be a matte finish, we'll see how it goes. And so painted the entire blue, and this color is like perfect. It was really a nice find in this SMS premium paint. Once I had that painted the leading edges in silver, put the markings down, and those markings all came from Cali Graphics. I worked with her on these, and they are vinyl, all printed vinyl, and so put those down one by one. And the nice thing with vinyl, especially when you're dealing with a smooth airplane like this, is that they go on really nicely, really easily. Once I had all of the markings on, I ended up spraying the entire airframe with a flat clear, and this is the Rust-Oleum 2x non-yellowing matte clear. A pencil isn't gonna write over a glossy piece of vinyl, it's just not gonna work. So sprayed the entire thing with a matte clear, and that's when all of that texture I was kind of seeing from the sheen of that blue paint started to disappear. Matte finishes can hide blemishes and all kinds of things, and so that is really the nice thing about that. Because the way that it reflects the light, it just kind of absorbs it. I was really happy about that. So I continued on applying pencil panel lines all over the airframe. And as it turned out, the pencil was the absolute perfect look on this. The reality is, on the dark colors, you're not really gonna see the panel lines popping through, and you don't see it in pictures either. When I clear coated the pencil, it still had a small definition that popped through in the finish. That's why I ended up going the pencil route. I tried a bunch of different things, and it ended up working out perfectly. And so I used a 1/2 millimeter lead pencil, mechanical pencil, and straight edges. You know, it's not a real big model. I didn't go super crazy in the detail of it all either. Just, you know, was looking for a nice basic look on the panel lines. And I had to spray a clear over it again because I wanted to do some weathering. Otherwise, the pencil panel lines will get smeared. They will disappear like if you apply acrylic thinner on it. You got to protect all of that work that you've done with the panel lines. And I didn't want to go crazy on the weathering because the reality is, when you look at the full-scale Panther, especially when they were in operation, they were pretty clean generally speaking. They didn't have a bunch of fading or anything like that, and I think part of it was because things were changing so rapidly that the aircraft just weren't in operation for very long. Plus, the dark blue tends to hide a lot of, you know, oil stains and streaks and stuff. And so all I ended up doing was just applying some raw umber washes for oil stains and streaks on the underside and a few random areas on the wings and the fuselage, and that was it. After that, I was done. I sprayed a really light clear coat over the weathered areas that I had done just to protect it a little bit. You know, every model is kind of different, right? And the approach is different, and we're not trying to replicate years of use, we're trying to simulate it. That's where research, looking at pictures of the aircraft in operation, really should be your guide for what the end product is gonna look like. In spite of, you know, battling foam texture, I'm really happy with how the model came out. I'm excited to go get it flown now. That is gonna be the next step. But until then, let's take this outside, give you guys a sneak peek of the finished model out in the daylight. With all of the additional features, you know, we got a new canopy, new cockpit, body flaps, speed brakes, the works. And in addition to this really cool brand new scale color paint scheme. Let's check it out. All right, the Panther is done. Now it is time to fly this model and really see how it responds to all of that extra work that we've done. You know, my experience has been that, you know, through a refinish like this where you smooth out the airframe, you stiffen it up, that they tend to fly even better. So it'll be really interesting to see how it responds. I anticipate it's gonna be really cool. And you know, with those body flaps, I've personally flown larger Panthers with body flaps and they land amazing. I'm excited to see what this little one's gonna do because I expect that it's gonna be really favorable landing characteristics and probably come in at a crawl. Otherwise, you know, if you guys would really like to deep dive on this entire process, I have actually simplified it into a 5-step method in terms of, you know, painting, finishing, all of that stuff. You know, I talk in depth about that in my book, but I've also put together a video course as well. If that is of interest to you, head on over to artofscalemodeling.com and you can check it out there. I've tried to put together as much information all in one place as I could. Otherwise, if you'd like to see the last video we did on this model with all the modifications that we made, you can see that here. Otherwise, next time we're gonna be taking this out to the field, getting this model flown. So until then, I'll see you at the field.